Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are calling from today. I knew there's a few people internationally joining us today, and as we see the attendees list rise, which is very encouraging. An early morning webinar for me, 8 o'clock for us in Sydney and Brisbane, which is the earliest so far of the webinars I've done, but one of the most exciting, I think. So welcome this morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, to our Smart Recovery webinar. We will just introduce our guest speaker very shortly. For those that don't know me, my name's Dan. I'm one of the national program managers and trainers at Smart Recovery, and been working in this field for about 18 or 19 years professionally. What we'll call it prior to 2002, 2003, we'll call it hands-on vocational training. That is a very nice way maybe to put been around the block and lived experience in this field as well. So throughout this discussion and chat that we're looking forward to having with Dr. Lembke, I might just share a little bit here and there what's relevance to my journey and hopefully many of the other SMART community. So before we do get started and I introduce our guest, I'll just do a welcome to country, what we do in Australia, and just to recognise the traditional custodians of the land wherever people are joining us from today. And I'm up in Brisbane. It's very, very rainy in Brisbane today. So yeah, we'll keep an eye on that one. But I'm coming from Quandamooka land up in the Redlands coast. So we'll introduce our guest speaker, or a person that we'll have a conversation with today. And we're just going to offer a bit of a chat, a bit of an exploration around some of the stuff that I read a fantastic book a few weekends ago, and also if there's any conversations that or questions that people have, please feel free to post it in the chat and the Q&A session of. We do have Sally, who's gone will be a little bit silent in the background, but she'll do her best to hold that space in the chat box function as well. If there's any really great questions, that would be fantastic. So let me introduce. So Anna Lembke, MD, Dr. Anna Lembke is a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine and a chief of Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. A clinician, a scholar, she is the author of more than 100 peer-reviewed publications and has testified before the United States House of Representatives and the Senate, has served an expert witness for the federal and state opioid litigation, and is internationally recognised leader in addiction medicine, treatment and education. In 2006, she published Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Were Duped and Patients Got Hooked and Why It's So Hard to Stop, highlighting the New York Times as one of the top 5 books to be read and understood around the opioid epidemic. Dr. Lembke appeared in the Netflix documentary The Social Dilemma, an unvarnished look at the impact of social media on our lives, and we might touch on that some today as well. Her latest book, as I said, fantastic read, read it a few weekends ago, Dopamine Nation, Finding a Balance in the Age of Indulgence. I think that's probably very relevant to everybody, not just some of the clients and people we work with. I've recognised it in many aspects of my day-to-day life, even now. But it was an instant New York Times and Los Angeles Times bestseller and has been translated in 25 different languages and combines neuroscience of addiction with wisdom of recovery to explore the problem of compulsive overconsumption in a dopamine overloaded world. Well, what an interesting topic to explore this morning. What a great way to start the day. So welcome, Anna. It's fantastic to have you along and join us. So thank you so much for calling in from California. I think 3 p.m. in the afternoon for you.
Yeah, that's right. And thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be here.
Fantastic. So I thought we'd just kind of explore a few questions and yeah, just have a bit of a chat. So kind of feel free to even go off on wherever you feel is relevant to the chat and the conversation. But I thought, first of all, maybe just worth to give you the floor just for however long you feel would be good. Can you share with us and give us a bit of an overview around your work and the findings that kind of led you to write the book Dopamine Nation, and As I say, take as much time as you want, and then we'll just explore that and have a bit of a conversation around that.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So there were a number of different threads over my 20 plus year career that kind of converged into the book Dopamine Nation. One of the early threads was rising numbers of patients coming in addicted to the pills their own doctors were prescribing, and in particular, chronic pain patients taking opioids prescribed by their doctors whose pain over time was not only not better, but actually worse than before they started opioids. And the conundrum of that. The second major thread was increasing numbers of initially men coming in the early 2000s with out of control addiction to online pornography, primarily, as well as online gambling. And then about 10 years later, young people coming in with the same, but also among boys, it was video game addiction, and among women, a more and more problematic social media use combined with eating disorders. And then, of course, we have added to all of that a serious mental health crisis here in the United States, and I would argue all over the world, with rising rates of depression, anxiety, inattention, despair, suicide. And really a puzzle there because clearly it implied that we were getting something terribly wrong about mental illness. In the countries where people have the most access to antidepressants, anxiolytics, mood stabilizers, and in which mental health disorders are least stigmatized, we have the most explosive rates of anxiety, depression, psychosis, addiction, suggesting that we were getting something fundamentally wrong about how to both understand the rising mental health crisis as well as to intervene. And then finally, something that happened to me about 15 years ago now, when I found myself getting addicted to escape fantasy fiction, primarily romance novels. My very brief story goes something like this. I've always been a reader. It's always been the way I self-soothe and also escape. Everything was fine in my life. In fact, good, healthy family life, great kids, very nice husband, meaningful work, no financial stressors. But I got turned on to romance novels for the first time by a friend of mine who suggested that I read the Twilight Saga. That's a teenage vampire romance series. And for some reason, that just hit a sweet spot, a mental sweet spot for me. And I became, I guess you could say, obsessed with vampire romance novels. And then I got a Kindle reader, and that then expanded to all different kinds of romance novels, of which I discovered through my Kindle and through Amazon. There's an entire endless universe of romance.
Thousands and thousands of books in that. My wife is very addicted to Kindle.
Yeah, right. And, I would sort of joke that I was addicted to romance novels, but never really took it seriously. But over the course of about 18 months, I did get to the point where I had a very narrow focus on the romance novels. I just really wanted to get through everything else that I was doing so that I could have my alone time to read my romance novels. I was staying up later and later in the night, sometimes 2 and 3 in the morning, and I have to get up early for work. So I'd be exhausted in the day, resenting my patients, resenting my kids and my husband because they were taking away from my time to read romance novels. And eventually progressed to the point where I was reading frank erotica, not consistent with the things I'm interested in or my values, and even taking these books to work and reading in the 10 minutes between patients, reading at family social functions, going and finding a room and reading, and generally feeling sort of depressed and anxious in a way that I hadn't for a very long time. So through an interaction with a student in which I had to role play a patient, talk about a behavior I wanted to change, suddenly became aware that this was a behavior I wanted to change. I didn't say romance novels, I just said late night fiction reading. And then I decided to, take a page out of my own counseling book and abstain for 4 weeks. And I was shocked at how difficult it was for me to do that. After 4 weeks of abstinence, I felt a lot better, decided I could go back and read in moderation. And I actually binged for that entire weekend. And that was that series of events that made me realize that thing called addiction that I thought I was immune to, that in fact my brain had been partially hijacked. Not to trivialize severe life-threatening addictions, mine clearly wasn't, but it was clear that my motivational and reward systems had been abducted, so to speak, by this seemingly benign endeavor of reading. So that all of that came together for me into kind of what is the big idea in Dopamine Nation, which is that our world has become drugified, that everything is more reinforcing, more bountiful, more accessible, more novel, and more potent. Even things that we typically think of as healthy have now been turned into drugs because of those 4 factors, making us all vulnerable to the problem of addiction. And I do believe this is the enduring problem that we'll be facing for at least the next hundreds of years. And it also made me seriously rethink how we're intervening for things like anxiety and depression, where we typically prescribe an antidepressant or recommend psychotherapy, and instead thinking about actually taking away these seemingly trivial intoxicants that accumulate through the course of our day as a way to reset reward pathways and get us out of depression and anxiety, which is now my primary intervention. And, it works. So that's what motivated me to write the book.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's probably many that can relate to that. As I've shared very briefly with you before we jump online there, I can go back many, many years ago, nearly 20 years ago now, and kind of understand what was kind of going on for me in my journey. Grew up in the 90s and into early 2000s with quite significant heroin addiction, which is, you can understand, easily hijack someone's life. But I think even now, it's still recognizing that these types of habitual patterns and stuff are pretty normal for people. And for you, it's romance novels. For me, even now, it might be staying on Netflix binges with my big bars of chocolate, or other behaviors. I think social media or telephones at the moment is quite frightening prospect for us. And I might touch on this later on, but I found some statistics around smartphones, and I know that's a piece of work that was very close to your heart. Around 7 billion people actually have smartphones, which was quite surprising to me, thinking that it's only 7.8 in the whole of the world, and all the different kind of cultures that probably wouldn't think of. And that, that's you said the hypodermic needle of the modern day. If that's what we have, a hypodermic needle of the hit of cocaine in our hand available to us every day, which is quite frightening, isn't it? So, yeah. And you talk about the age of indulgence. So I was curious just to hear from you. How do you think wealth and poverty, you talked about that earlier, and the different cultures and how they play a part in the outcomes and we see regarding addiction and these cycles? Because I've been to different countries over the years, maybe not as developed countries. And even though they have some issues with dysentery and malnutrition, all these things, most of them are a lot happier than it seems like the Western world are, and we have this abundance of things. So what's your thoughts around that? What was the thought around that, the subtitle that you came up with?
Yeah, well, I mean, so if you look at, for example, world happiness surveys, which have been being conducted for at least the last 50 years, what you saw is a consistent rise in population happiness as countries got richer. Except for the last 20 years where something changed. And now the richest countries in the world, you're seeing a steady decrease in happiness. Again, this idea that Poverty is clearly a huge human stressor and a very well-known risk factor for addiction. But it turns out that extreme wealth probably is too. And the most vulnerable people in the world when it comes to addiction are probably poor people living in wealthy nations. First of all, they're struck just with the moral inequity of the great disparity between what they have and the wealthiest people in their country have. But also, poor people in wealthy nations have access to cheap sources of dopamine that poor people in poor countries may not necessarily have. And that, combined with multi-generational trauma, racism, inequity, et cetera, creates a nexus of addiction that's really striking. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's for sure. And I've talked to some people, and I've visited the places in Africa and South Africa and stuff, and yeah, you see it. You see the disparity. I'm walking down the street and there's literally mansions, and then immediately next to it are these shanty towns. And I actually, even though chatting to a lot of these people and a lot of these poverty-stricken people, they were so happy and content with what they had, even though they had very little compared to what they are. So I can absolutely relate to that for sure. And can you explain what you talked about self-binding in your book? And I obviously have an understanding of that, and I've reflected on practices and behavioral strategies that we put in place. But in the smart recovery, we might not necessarily call it self-binding, but it's just putting certain things in place to try and stop you engaging in certain behaviors. So what was the synopsis of that in your book, Self-Binding?
Yeah, so self-binding acknowledges two important truths. The first is that our willpower is not an infinite resource. We wake up with more willpower than we're going to have at the end of the day. And most of us, or many of us, also will wait till the end of the day to use our particular drug of choice, so that we're using in the exact context when we have the least amount of willpower. The other thing that self-binding acknowledges is that we live in this world that's constantly inviting us to consume. It's not even just a matter of us having to go look for our drug of choice. These drugs and their triggers literally chase us down. We are constantly being prompted or texted or promoted with some product or another. We actually, live to consume on some level in a successful capitalist society. All of which makes it extremely difficult to stop using our substance or behavior, in that context. So what self-binding is a way of acknowledging the limits of our own willpower and the drugification of modern life, such that prior to being in that situation where we have exhausted our willpower and we're being presented with a substance or behavior that we're trying to limit our use of, instead, we anticipate that moment and create both literal and metacognitive barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice. So that can be like literal physical barriers. My patients have told me things like, I call the hotel in advance of arriving and ask them to remove the minibar. I ask them to remove the minibar and the television. I don't keep potato chips in my house. I only, I lock up my smartphone at night. I delete certain apps. So ways of like literally creating distance between ourselves and the thing that we want to get, allowing us to just press that pause button, which then gives us just a moment more to bring in our reasons, our motivations about why we don't want to use. In addition to space being a potential barrier, we can also use time. Time is things, especially for people whose goal is moderation and not abstinence, things like designating use on certain days of the week or within a certain hours during the day, like a little bit like intermittent fasting. Yeah. I talk a lot about intermittent digital use, trying to not use before 9 a.m. or after 5 p.m., trying to take a digital Sabbath from Friday evening to Saturday evening. Those are things I try to do in my life. So using time, sometimes time is it's like a finish line, saying I'm not going to use until I finish this project or do this thing, and then I'm going to allow myself 30 minutes of mindless, TikTok or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So time is a way. And then the other way is what I call categorical self-binding. And this is very useful, again, for drugs that permeate every aspect of our lives, like tech and the internet, and also food, things that we couldn't just abstain from. So we have to develop categories, subcategories of the larger category that we determine our drug of choice. So for me, it might be YouTube videos of Dr. Pimple Popper and American Idol. I cannot watch those because once I start, I need somebody to literally physically
Opens the floodgates. Yep. Sure.
Yeah. Or for food, it might be I don't eat sugar, or I don't eat processed food, or I don't eat carbohydrates, things like that help people kind of subcategorize. Sometimes these can be interestingly sacred categories. So making the drug a sacred thing on a sacred day in a sacred context. So that's the idea behind self-binding, is sort of
Absolutely.
these barriers.
And it was touching on just a question later on, because I think it's very relevant to our smart recovery community, with smart being a harm minimization kind of approach, which abstinence is part of that. And many people choose that and need that. For me, abstinence from that lifestyle that I was living of heroin and drugs and just everything had to stop. It was clear. Yes. But as we understand, and we're looking beyond just typical alcohol drugs thing, we understand that there are many behaviors that can be detrimental to our values and the things we would like to achieve in life, and the identity and the person we want to be. They're not necessarily wrong, and they might have a very subtle impact, but in smart, if it's a problem to you, it's a problem. It's something that you want to work on. It's something you want to work on. And I think we definitely identify with the space and time. Like people will create a couple of days off something just to test things out. Some small, easy steps, some small goals, even if it's delaying drinking till midday, or whether, as you say, my space at the minute is trying to put my phone away from my bedside. Because I'm waking up in the morning saying good morning to my phone before I even turn around, say good morning to my wife. She's normally sleeping and snoring, so there's an excuse that I can give. But I think I'm always constantly thinking about this now, even with my children. And maybe that's not so much a self-binding, but more of a forced binding, where I'm putting parameters on YouTube and different things on their computers and their laptops. It might be a little bit different, but in essence, it's about putting some strategies in place to try and just gain some elements of control, and just seeing how you kind of respond to that. But
so let me just respond to a couple things. When it comes to these digital drugs and our children, this is a huge challenge for parents. Okay. And I think parents sometimes just give up. And I would really urge parents not to do that, especially parents of younger children where you still have control. It's essential that our children realize that these digital media is a drug, and it's potentially very addictive, and that we need to help them and help each other find ways to moderate use. And we need to do that early on, and ask for help from each other. So I really urge people to get in there and fight the good fight. Once our kids get to be teenagers, it's much harder to do that, but still we need to talk about it, and we need to be honest about the ways in which this technology is really impoverishing our lives and our human connections in many ways.
Absolutely.
And also, it's not an individual problem, it's a collective problem. So we need to get schools to create tech.
I was just going to say that, they've literally got their own iPads and stuff at school as well, but we hope that they will understand the developmental brain of our children they're working with. We hope that they will manage and balance that. And absolutely, it's a real challenge, and just even this last couple of days, I just see the change in my children's behaviors within 30, 40 minutes of watching something, and it just flicks like a switch. And so we're again, probably not a self-binded, but maybe a forced binding where, they need
Right.
days away from tech after school. There's just not, and the change in the behavior is quite remarkable. The creativity that comes from that as well is quite remarkable to watch.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and acknowledging that when we do take the devices away, if we have been allowing our kids to have access, when we take it away, they will go into withdrawal,
Yeah,
and
for sure.
and those universal symptoms of withdrawal are anxiety, irritability,
Yeah,
insomnia, depression. And for kids, it can be rage outbursts,
absolutely.
screaming, like really dysregulated.
Mm.
But the key is to let them have an extended experience where they're not on the devices, and then let them see how much better they feel eventually,
Yeah,
and do it together as a family. I also just want to emphasize, this doesn't mean the corporations are off the hook. We
yeah,
absolutely need, or the federal government. This is a huge collective problem, but we can start with what we can try to control.
for sure. And I'm going to move on to looking at pain side of things, but just another comment on that is, and I think parents need to be a bit go easy on themselves as well. And I can understand, we're talking about this world of indulgence where we need to have fast cars, we need the big houses, and so parents are driven to work long hours and to do all this because this is what society's telling us. So therefore, what happens? Well, that's your virtual babysitter right there when you're busy and stressed. I find my wife and I fall into that trap all the time. When we're unwell, even today, everyone's unwell, we're like, the kids are going to watch a movie or something, and it's like, so it's just hard. But I think we've got to recognize that in ourselves and what our part to play, but go easy on ourselves as well. And yeah.
Well, that's right. And also importantly, recognize that this work hard, play hard mentality actually drives our addictive behaviors. So I know for me, when I have a long, hard day, or especially when I travel for work, I will binge digital media because it's almost the only way that I can calm myself, or feel that I can calm myself down. And I feel I'm justified in doing it. So this is really important to acknowledge. I have patients who they want to get their addictive behaviors under control, but they don't want to change their work life.
Sure.
And I tell them, you're not going to be able to do that as long as you're driving that hard at work, because the one fuels the other.
Yeah, and that's you might be aware of one of our points. So smart recovery works from 4 points, really, as a bit of a philosophy that underpins the principles. And one of them is building and maintaining motivation. If you don't have that, literally you don't have anything. Coping with urges and cravings and those triggers and those cycles, understanding that. Problem solving, looking at the kind of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors process of cognitive process. But more importantly, not more importantly, but just as important, is lifestyle balance, and really understanding how we get that balance. Now, I'm interested to talk a little bit about pain, something that people don't like talking about, to be honest. But in our society, we do everything we can to avoid pain. I believe pain is actually really healthy and tells us some information that we really need to know. I think it's a created kind of thing within us that's important. Why do you think we do all we can to avoid discomfort? And what would you encourage people to kind of approach this better when it comes to change?
Well, first, I think it's important to acknowledge that we reflexively approach pleasure and avoid pain. We do it without thinking. In fact, we have to think about doing its opposite. And that's been our wiring over millions of years of evolution, in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, which is the world that we have lived in for most of human existence, but not the world that we live in now. The world that we live in now is a world that really quite excellently accommodates our instinct to run away from pain, and does that so well that it really drives us toward compulsive overconsumption. So one of the things I think we need to do in order to live healthier and more balanced lives is to stop trying to outrun our pain, because it will catch up with us no matter how fast and how far we run. And so one of the real secrets is to stop and turn and face that thing that we're running away from and just experience it.
Mm.
And the incredible thing that happens when we do that, which for most of us, myself included, we have to be really, really exhausted from running
Mm.
before we're willing to do that. But when we do, something really amazing and paradoxical happens, where we get a relief from our suffering, which is closer to a real respite than anything we could achieve through our running away from the pain. So I
Yeah.
think this is really important, and it's not something that's in our culture. It's not something we learn or teach our children. In fact, we teach our children to be afraid of pain. We teach parents that if their children experience pain in any form, it's setting them up for psychopathology in the future, instead of seeing that as an opportunity, a good thing, and having the belief that someone who goes through something very hard will come out stronger for it, which
Yeah.
is what people used to think 150 years ago, but now we
Mm.
don't think that anymore. And I can tell you as a parent myself, very, very hard to let my kids fall, because we see them going in a wrong direction when they don't see it. But we just we have to believe in them in a way that
Absolutely.
they can fall and they can pick themselves up again, and that will help them develop the mental calluses to succeed as adults, and give them a touchstone they can reference as they
Mm.
encounter future difficulties, and say to themselves, I got through that, I can get through this.
Absolutely. And I think we can rob the opportunity from our children when we are overprotective. And, I find myself doing it sometimes. It's like, oh no, don't climb on there. Well, probably more my wife, because I'm normally like, yeah, yeah, climb on there. But just be aware, what do you think would happen if you slipped? Just so that they understand that there is risks, but they take calculated risks. And we talk about that in smart recovery sometimes. Obviously, as facilitators and clinicians in general, you have a duty of care for your participants or your clients. But also I talk about the opposite of that, which I call dignity of risk.
Yeah.
Now, I want to create a space where you have the dignity to go away and make mistakes and be okay with that. It's going to be painful. It's going to be hard. You're experiencing something without your crutch that you've not experienced for many, many years. And it's going to be tough, but you have to understand that. It's part of the learning. And sometimes what I encourage people I train and participants to just think of people going to the gym. That's something that people can relate to. If I go to the gym after the first time for the first time in a couple of years, and I go hard, what happens? Well, I wake up in the morning in agony, right? Now I could say, I'm not going to the gym ever again. I don't like that. That's not for me. Or I can really truly understand, well, that muscle's sore. Why? Because it's an area of vulnerability. So if I go to the gym and work on that area of vulnerability because my body has told me that it needs it, what happens? That muscle becomes the strongest part of my body. And this is why I encourage people to journey through those storms and the storms of recovery, because when you come out the other side, as you said, the calluses, like your fingers on the guitar playing after a couple of years, it builds up something that you've never had before, and it really strengthens that area. And it's a strength in my own life, I feel, even though I'm still dealing with other things, but that's part of the journey. Fantastic. So I guess we talked about that. You talk about the pleasure and pain balance, and you talk about these gremlins that are constantly trying to balance this out. Is there anything else you'd like to add around how we balance that out, how we get these gremlins to kind of help find that homeostasis, that kind of equilibrium?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's helpful to understand how we process pleasure and pain, that they're co-located in the brain, the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and that they're like opposite sides of a balance or a teeter-totter. And that, one of the main rules governing that balance is that it wants to restore homeostasis or a level balance. And it does that first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus was. So if we do something that's immediately reinforcing, like watch a TikTok video, that releases dopamine, our reward neurotransmitter. It tilts our balance to the side of pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than our brains adapt by downregulating dopamine neurotransmission, not just to baseline, but below baseline. I talk about that as these neuroadaptation gremlins that hop on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again, but stay on there until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the come down, the after effect, the hangover. Now, in a world of scarcity, we would have not had more than whatever that little bit of reward was. And and we have a come down and we want more of it, but we work hard and we look around and there's nothing more there. So eventually those gremlins hop off and homeostasis is restored and that baseline craving goes away. But in a world of overwhelming overabundance like we live in now, of course, as we experience that come down or dopamine deficit state, we reach for more of our drug. It's physiologically hardwired. And as a result, more and more gremlins accumulate on the pain side of the balance. And eventually we end up with enough gremlins to fill this whole room and they're camped out there. And now we're entering addicted brain where we've changed our hedonic set point. We need more of our drug in more potent forms to get the same effect, not to get high, but just to level the balance. And so I think understanding this is essential for understanding what happens as we become addicted, but also to appreciate that if that initial stimulus is pain, like we exercise or do an ice cold water plunge, clean out our closet, meditate, pray, journal, anything that takes effortful engagement and some upfront work, we're pressing on the pain side of the balance. And as a result, those upregulating homeostatic gremlins hop on the pleasure side, and we actually get our dopamine indirectly. And so that's great because we want to feel the rush, right? And the nice thing about getting dopamine indirectly like that is that we don't go into that dopamine deficit state. So for example, with exercise, dopamine levels rise gradually over the latter half of the activity, remain elevated for hours after the activity has stopped, and then eventually go back down to baseline levels of dopamine firing. So we never go below baseline. Whereas with intoxicants, we get a sudden upward spike. Then we're in dopamine free fall, not just to baseline, but below baseline. And then we're craving. If our drug is accessible, we'll use again to get another spike. And then we'll eventually spend all of our time, energy, and creativity in that cycle of drug seeking, intoxication, withdrawal, drug seeking, and end up with a hedonic set point that is well below baseline levels of dopamine firing.
And I've been trying them myself, Anna. I've been doing cold showers, and it's not pleasant. I was wanting to get an ice bath for my garden. This is my birthday request, is to purchase the ice bath thing, and it's not nice. But actually, I found it quite addictive. We want to call it. I find it quite pleasurable once you get into that. And it got me thinking, I read in your book as well, is that people can actually seek that out as well, can't they? Not just the pleasurable aspect of drugs and alcohol, but the pain side of things, because you get that response and that rush afterwards, that people can go out and seek pain as well, and that can become the thing that they turn to. Is that correct?
Yeah, so generally, I do prescribe what's called hormesis, or the science of using mild to moderate painful stimuli as a way to upregulate our own healing mechanisms, including increasing dopamine. But it's true, if you take that to the extreme, you can get addicted to that source of dopamine as well, even though it's indirect. So I do occasionally see people who are addicted to exercise, or getting addicted to ice cold water immersion, or cutting is an example of that, where you have an extreme source of pain followed by a flooding of endogenous or innate opioids. But very quickly you exhaust those endogenous opioids. So then, on repetition, you have to cut deeper and, in order to get the same effect. So it's not a healthy behavior. Sure. But I do think that, you could imagine, okay, so, well, is then the message to just live in homeostasis and not ever experience a reward? That's a philosophical question as well as a physiologic question. I think most people would find that relatively unsatisfying. I think most people feel like they need to feel joy, and that there are different ways to get that joy. But the key here is that joy is relative. And if you've overexposed your brain to a lot of very potent reinforcers, you're no longer going to have the capacity to enjoy a sunset or a fine meal with friends or playing with your child in a sandbox. So we do have to remove these intoxicants for long enough to reset our, dopaminergic firing to baseline in order to recapture joy in more modest rewards. And one of the ways to do that is actually to intentionally do things that are hard, as long as you don't take it to an extreme.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And it makes it challenging, isn't it? Because we do have people that come through smart recovery that, abstinence might be their goal, but really they're far, far from that stage, and they don't have the right supports, they don't have the clinical interventions that can help them get to that point. So we have to kind of hold this space with them that is about managing it. And, maybe there's detoxing, it might just be for a couple of hours or just something, but I can understand that, because in my own life, I had to obviously go through detox from significant drugs. And I found that, after about a month or two, I was starting to taste things, I was starting to smell things, I was starting to even just go to the movies, and it was such a buzz. Like Tuesday night, movie night at the recovery center was and I'm like, that would have never have bothered me one little bit. Like, so you can understand that that balance starts to come back and your body starts to functioning on a
Right.
normal kind of scale as well. So one thing I'm curious to touch on, and it's a bit of a hot topic and a bit of in some models of AODs and some other groups and things that we kind of work with. I guess around language. So I guess awareness and acknowledging there's an issue is the first step for me. If you don't have that, then you'll never change. Or you'll have everyone telling you there's a problem, but until you come to that point yourself. But in SMART, we try and work hard to manage our language and avoid kind of labels, especially early on when they're talking about I'm an addict, an alcoholic, I'm this and that. I guess just because some people struggle with the stigma that can be attached to it. And what's your thoughts on language and how it's been ingrained in the sector? And at times we find it can be an actual barrier. Yes, that an awareness is important, but it can be a barrier to move beyond what's a behavior that I'm engaging in rather than an identity that's a disease for the rest of my life. I'm just curious what your thoughts are around that.
I mean, I think language is really important, and the kind of language that will help somebody live a healthier life is going to vary from person to person. Language is closely tied to our self-concept and our self-narrative and our identity.
Absolutely.
How we tell our stories matters, and the language that we use matters. For some people, using the language of I'm an addict, I'm an alcoholic, that is helpful to them and often is tied to the community that they get into recovery with. So if the identity of that community is a community of alcoholic addicts, then that's going to be important language to adopt and be comfortable with to get into recovery with that community.
Yeah.
If that's not something that somebody's comfortable with, and they identify with another type of language to describe their behaviors as separate from their core identity, then they're probably going to have to find a different community. So I don't judge the language one way or another. I'm believe in whatever works, and I think people temperamentally are just going to need different things.
Yeah, for sure. And it's something what I do, and I would completely agree. What I would pose the question when I'm having these conversations with participants is that helpful for you? Is that what you want? And I've chatted to people that have called themselves that and they've been abstinent for 20 years. That I'll be the first one to pat them on the back and say, well done, if that's what it takes. But I think it's important to challenge our own core beliefs sometimes as well, because I think we can grow up with them. We can get told this is what we should think, this is what we should do. We've got to come to an awareness of ourselves to say, what do I want? What do I think is going to be helpful for me? And if it's this, if it's that, then whatever works, as you say. We had a little question that came through, which is about connection. So I'm not going to dig into the question because the next one is kind of touching on this anyway. And you mentioned one of the studies, and I would assume that you would be aware of this one. We had Dr. Robert Waldinger on a few weeks ago, and he was talking around the Harvard study of adult development. And we talked about the importance of connection. And after 70, 80 years of a study, drum roll, positive relationships. Sometimes I think, because I'm not a scientist, sometimes I think we overcomplicate things, Anna.
Yeah.
The result of what brings contentment and happiness is relationships. I think that's why we're designed. But how do you see community, relationships, and connection play a positive part of well-being? And do you have any insights on how relationships can improve well-being and that balanced dopamine responses.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's clear that, addiction is a disease of isolation, and that the antidote for addiction or compulsive overconsumption is to establish healthy connections with other human beings, and that we are wired for that. We are wired to be social creatures, to move in tribes, to co-regulate with other humans. But the problem today, there are many problems that make the modern life extremely difficult. Number one, these devices mean that we cultivate connections with people who are geographically isolated from us in many instances. This meeting is a great example of that. Hopefully these are positive, meaningful connections for people on this call that are healthy and good for them. But we're also disparately located, so that if somebody on this call gets physically ill and needs somebody to bring over a chicken soup, there's probably not many people on this call who would be able to do that for each other. So that has.
Please bring it to me today, because I need it.
So that has a lot of implications. One of which I've been thinking a lot about recently, is the polarization that's happening, in the digital virtual world, which I think is part of the way that we attempt to strengthen human connections among people who are geographically disparate. One of the ways that we signal to each other is that we're connected is by expressing ideas in their most extreme version, because nuance and subtlety don't survive in the virtual world. And that kind of polarization, I think, is ultimately not useful, but it comes from this geographic disparity. The other thing is that we've also managed, no surprise here, to drugify human connection. So that's what social media is, right? It's distilled down into its most reinforcing parts, that instant connection with a beautiful other who, if we get frustrated with, we can just swipe right, swipe left, and find somebody else. So we don't have to do any of the work up front to find them. We don't have to tolerate any of the distress when the relationship isn't going smoothly. So now it's easy to get addicted to human connection through here. The other, so bottom line study, of course, human connection, important for human thriving and also for recovery. But I always like to include in this sort of topic more broadly is the way that we can also become addicted to other people and use them in a codependent fashion and in an ultimately narcissistic and addictive way. So they become our drug. Their well-being becomes the way that we regulate ourselves. And of course, this is what often happens in, families where addiction has been prevalent. But, I think any family is vulnerable. I know as a mother, I'm very vulnerable to sort of co-regulating around how my kids are doing, which again, the line between healthy investment in your offspring and narcissistic codependency is a fine one. And it's not like you're on one side or the other. I think I'm often drifting between those two. Yeah. But I'm attempting to be aware of it. I think as a society, and I was thinking about parents are often not aware of when they're drifting into like narcissistic over engagement, as opposed to sort of healthy, supportive investment, or spouses or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the challenge, in smart recovery and probably other support groups, is that how do you balance that? Because it can become that dependency upon that, because that's where you find the connection, that's where you find this meaning and well-being and understanding, which is really, really important in recovery, especially to know that you're not alone and you can get some strategies and some tips. But eventually, when does that stop, or where does it become a catalyst, or at least a thing that holds you back because you've become dependent upon attending a smart meeting, and I have to attend this smart meeting or everything else comes crumbling down. So we're really mindful of exploring that with people, and that's where that lifestyle balance comes in. And I think for me, on a personal note, I worked through enough of my garbage and different things and develop strategies and put positive people in my life, and I've got a balance in my life, that I just no longer need to think about those behaviors in the same way. I don't think of myself as an addict person. I don't think of myself even in recovery. I don't even think about it. Am I to say that I've got everything sorted out? Absolutely not. But I can definitely recognize how engaging in certain group supports or certain people, and how that can become something that can be helpful, but also on the flip side, not so much. But
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that all intimate relationships involve being dependent on each other, right? If we didn't need each other, we wouldn't be in relationship. That's what it means. So it's making that distinction between mutual dependency, which is healthy, and a kind of codependency, which is where we're essentially using this other person to meet our own
absolutely.
narcissistic ends. And so I think that that's where we just need to be thoughtful about it.
And there's pleasure and pain, rewards and challenges in relationships. And I think probably why some people bail out of relationships so quickly.
Yeah.
Do you know, they're there for their own self-gratification or whatever, you've shared there. And when they experience pain, and we're trying to avoid pain, the easy thing is just to bail out of that relationship. And we see the divorce rates and different things really increasing. And I'm always curious about that one in regards to the bigger picture of what we've shared today.
Well, I let me just add to that. I see though a lot of people who can't who are not in relationships because not because they're not willing to tolerate distress, but because they're genuinely confused by human behavior and the ways in which the world is not a warm and predictable place. And they become very disillusioned and find that ultimately it's worse to be in relationship than it is to just be alone. And for the kinds of relationships that they've had, that's true. So the thing then has to be, well, teaching people, who to look for, who to be in relationship with, and how to cultivate, to actually give them hope that there are people out there, who will do what they said they were going to do, who will not lie to you, who will care for you and be kind. And then also, trying to raise, a generation of kids to be that person and to not use other people. So
that's a big challenge, isn't it? It's a big challenge. And unfortunately, when people don't find that, they'll find connection in something else, and that's unfortunate. Sometimes these behaviors can be really, really damaging. So
yeah.
I just thought there's any final comments or any resources you'd like to share. I thought I'll just stick up with if you wanted to check out Anna's website. Obviously, I haven't had the opportunity to read your other book. I might get into that one next, Anna, but there'll be plenty of places if you don't already have a copy of this. But is there anything else you'd kind of like to add before we finish up today, Anna?
No, thank you for a good discussion, and thanks to the group for the comments in the chat. Let's see, looks like there's one. Thanks, Angie. Let's see, there's one question I'm happy to answer in the time remaining. Is dopamine the reward or the neurotransmitter that motivates us to get other rewards like endorphins, serotonin? Okay, so yeah, this is a question that comes up. Is dopamine important for pleasure or is it important for motivation? And the answer is that it's important for both pleasure and motivation. And there's a famous experiment that if you take a rat and you engineer it to have no dopamine in the reward pathway, it will eat food and get pleasure from the food if you put the food directly in its mouth. But if you put the food a body length away, it will starve to death because it's not motivated to do the work. And the way that dopamine probably, so we're always releasing dopamine at a baseline tonic level. And when it goes above baseline firing, that's where we get euphoria from that, or pleasure. And when it goes below, we're in that craving state, and that craving state is what creates the motivation. So it's these fluctuations in dopamine that give pleasure and both induce motivation.
Yeah, that's great. Great question. Thanks for that. And we are just running out of time. So I just want to, thank you again, Anna, for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure. And Always exciting when I've just read something and just to be able to talk to that person as well. So thank you for your time, and thank you so much for everyone joining us today as well. Some really great comments have been through there, and we've, I'd love to explore so many of the other questions that we got to, but unfortunately we're out of time, and I know Anna, you have other pressing things to get to. So thank you again. Thank you for everyone for joining us, and we'll hopefully see you again at another webinar or podcast down the road. Thank you.
Great, thank you.